The letter from the Compact Exchange office arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day I usually spent reviewing my second-year cadets' fieldwork submissions. I set the stack of folders aside and read it twice, because the first time I assumed I had misread the destination. I had not misread it. The Varith Defense Institute, Ashurath Complex, Sector 9. A reciprocal exchange appointment, 60 days, observational delegate classification, no formal instructional authority. My name on the travel authorization. My academy's seal at the bottom of the confirmation. I set the letter down and looked out the window at the training yard, where my second years were running a perimeter assessment exercise in light rain. They moved well. They communicated without shouting. They would fail the assessment anyway because Cadet Dresch always left his left flank unanchored when he fixated on a primary objective. But that was a problem for Thursday. The thing I was thinking about was the Varith Defense Institute. I went there when I was 18 years old. That would have been 34 years ago. The exchange program had been running for 6 years at that point, and I was in the second cohort, 12 human cadets from 7 academies, shipped off to spend a year at the institution that had, at considerable diplomatic expense, agreed to teach us how to think about large-scale conflict. Not tactics in any narrow sense, not the management of small unit engagements. They meant the architecture of it. The way a campaign breathes. The way logistics and intelligence and morale and terrain all push against each other, until one of them breaks and the whole structure resolves in a direction no one predicted from the outside but which, in retrospect, looks inevitable. That was what the Varith had spent 300 years systematizing, and for reasons of their own, they had decided to share the bones of it with the species that kept showing up at multi-system conferences without, as one Varith administrator reportedly put it, a coherent framework for understanding why they had won most of the things they had survived. I was 18. I spent a year learning things I did not have vocabulary for yet, in a building that smelled of mineral oil and old stone, taught by instructors who regarded me with the particular patience of people who understand that a student's confusion is a structural problem, not a personal failing. Senior instructor Tovesh ran the second quarter curriculum. He was precise, demanding, and absolutely certain that the frameworks he taught were correct, which they were, within the scope of the problems they had been designed to address. I went home at 19 with a year's worth of structural thinking crammed into my head, and I spent the next 33 years building on it. The Compact Exchange office was asking me to go back. I put the letter in my desk drawer, told my second years I would be away for 2 months, arranged coverage for the fieldwork reviews, and booked a transit at the end of the week. The institute was smaller than I remembered, which I understood was a function of returning somewhere as an adult that you had known as a child. The outer courtyard was the same gray-white stone. The transit depot was in a different location. They had rebuilt the eastern approach since my time, added a covered walkway that connected to the main academic complex. The mineral oil smell was gone. They had replaced the heating system at some point with something cleaner and quieter. The corridors were the same dimensions, the same brushed pale stone with the faint amber veining that ran through all the older structures in this sector. I was met by an exchange coordinator named Tessavith who was young and efficient and explained the terms of my placement in careful, slightly formal standard, observational delegate. I could attend any academic session, any exercise, any assessment. I was welcome to speak with cadets or faculty informally. I held no formal instructional authority, which meant I could not set coursework, conduct official assessments, or issue any notation in a cadet's formal record. I was here to observe, to learn about the Institute's current curriculum, and to produce a report for the Compact Exchange office at the end of my 60 days. I said that was understood. She showed me to my quarters, which were comfortable, and gave me a schedule of upcoming sessions. I read through it that evening after dinner. The current cohort was in its second quarter. They were, as far as I could tell from the session titles, approximately where I had been at the same point in my own year here. I circled 3 sessions that were running in the next 2 days, and I went to sleep. The first session was a lecture. It was Tovesh. He was older, 34 years older, which is obvious to state but still requires acknowledgement when you see it. He moved with slightly more deliberation. His voice was the same, even, low, structured like a formal argument with no wasted connective tissue. He introduced the concept he was covering, the resource pressure cascade, the way a sustained campaign will always, eventually, force a command structure to choose between 2 necessities rather than between a necessity and a comfort, and he illustrated it with exactly the same case studies he had used in my year. The Vanthi coastal engagements, the Oresh border consolidation, the 3-year supply failure at Kesset Station that had ended a 70-year strategic standoff in a single logistical collapse. The cadets were attentive. They took good notes. One of them, a young Varith female in the 3rd row, compact and quick-eyed, asked a follow-up question about what happens when both necessities are genuinely equivalent, when there is no dominant pressure to resolve the cascade. Tovesh answered it cleanly, and his answer was technically correct, and I sat in the back row of the lecture hall and wrote 1 word in my notebook. The word was incomplete. Not wrong, incomplete. The answer he gave addressed the static case, 2 equal pressures, a command structure forced to choose arbitrarily between them. What it did not address was the dynamic case, which is what actually happens in practice, which is that equal pressures rarely stay equal, and the skill is not in the moment of choosing, but in reading the rate of change on each side early enough to make the choice look deliberate rather than panicked. The young Varith cadet was still looking at the instructor with the expression of someone who had received an answer and knew it was correct, and also knew it had not quite reached the shape of her question. I recognized that expression. I had worn it in this room 34 years ago. I did not say anything. I was an observational delegate. I wrote down the question and the answer, and I made my note. The second lecture I attended was from a different instructor, a younger faculty member named Orvith San who taught operational logistics. He was good. Better than I had expected, actually. He had a talent for making abstract supply chain principles concrete by anchoring them to specific material weights and transit times in the human, or in this case, Varith, tendency to underestimate the duration of loading operations. The cadets paid close attention to him. He asked questions back at them, which Tovesh did not do, and the back and forth had a useful friction to it, the kind that produces thinking rather than just reception. But even Orvith San's material stopped short of the current environment. His case studies ran up to 18 years ago. 18 years ago, the operational logistics picture was comprehensible from the principles he was teaching. The problem was what happened after, when the conflict environment shifted, and the supply chains that had previously been predictable became adaptive and fragmented, and sometimes deliberately mutable, and the logistics methodology that worked for a fixed transit system stopped working for one where the transit itself was the contested variable. I wrote 3 pages of notes after that lecture, and spent an hour that evening organizing them. There was a pattern forming, and it was the kind of pattern that you can see from the outside that is very difficult to see from inside it. The Institute's curriculum was internally consistent, rigorously taught, and correct in everything it addressed. It was simply not addressing approximately 15 years of accumulated evidence about how conflict had changed. Not because the faculty were incapable of addressing it, because they had not updated the thing they were teaching, and the thing they were teaching was very good, which made it easy to continue teaching it without asking whether it was still sufficient. I had seen this at my own academy. We had done it ourselves. We had noticed it, eventually, and corrected it, painfully and incrementally over several revision cycles. The correction was not pleasant. The people who had been teaching the pre-correction curriculum were not wrong about what they had taught. They were just working from a map that had not been redrawn since the terrain changed. The Vareth, from what I could see, had not yet noticed the discrepancy between the map and the terrain. Or perhaps they had noticed it, in the way you notice a thing you are not ready to act on, and had filed it under fourth quarter curriculum, where it would eventually get addressed, or perhaps it would stay there for another cycle. The exercise that broke things open came on the fourth day. It was a standard second quarter field assessment, a simulated multi-vector resource crisis, the kind of scenario designed to force cadets to triage competing demands under time pressure. The Vareth ran these exercises in a large hall on the building's lower level, the walls configured with projection arrays that could approximate any operational environment the scenario required. I had done this exercise myself in this hall in my second quarter. The scenario had been different in its specific content but identical in its structural architecture. Too many demands, not enough time, a scoring system that would penalize any cadet who tried to address every variable rather than identifying the correct 2 or 3 to prioritize. The current cohort was 22 cadets. The scenario ran for 4 hours. I watched from the observer gallery. The scenario they were running was a supply chain disruption in a multi-point contested area, 6 simultaneous pressure points, 6 different resource requirements, a command structure that could actively address 3 of them before the scenario's internal clock forced resolution. The cadets had to identify which 3. The scoring rubric gave positive weight to the 3 highest priority variables according to the Institute's threat model, and negative weight for time spent on the others. At the 2-hour mark, 3 of the 22 had been scored out. Their decision threads had collapsed into contradictory loops that the simulation had flagged as operationally unrecoverable. 6 more were in serious difficulty. The remaining 13 were doing better, but better in a specific sense. They were correctly identifying the high-priority variables and deprioritizing the rest, which was what the exercise was designed to teach them to do. The problem was that the exercise was teaching them to deprioritize a class of variable that, in the current threat environment, was not actually deprioritizable. The 6th pressure point in the scenario was a low-intensity background register signal, a slow-building adaptive disruption in one of the secondary supply routes that the scenario's initial briefing classified as marginal priority. Under the Institute's scoring rubric, the correct move was to ignore it. Its immediate impact was low, its resource demand was modest, and allocating attention to it came at a cost in the 3 main priority areas that the rubric would penalize heavily. What the rubric did not account for was the nature of adaptive disruptions. A slow-building adaptive disruption in a secondary supply route, in the current environment, was not the same as a slow-building disruption in the Vanthi coastal campaign era, where secondary routes stayed secondary. In the current environment, secondary routes became primary routes when the primary routes were contested. An adaptive disruption in a secondary route was often the leading indicator of a primary route interdiction attempt, and by the time the primary route was actually interdicted, the window for addressing the secondary route problem had long closed. You had to catch it while it still looked marginal. If you waited until it looked critical, you had already lost the tempo. The cadets who were doing well under the rubric were learning to do the wrong thing with confidence. I wrote a full page of notes. I wrote them carefully in small handwriting because the page was getting crowded. After the exercise concluded, the cadets gathered in the debrief chamber. Tovesh walked through the scoring. He indicated the 3 cadets who had been scored out and explained the decision points at which each had gone wrong. His analysis was accurate. The decision points he identified were real decision points, and the errors the cadets had made at those points were real errors. He did not mention the background noise signal at all. The young Vareth cadet from the lecture, I had learned her name by then. It was Orathan, a third-generation Institute student whose family had produced 2 senior faculty members, raised her hand at the end of the debrief and asked about it directly. She had noticed the signal. She had deprioritized it because the scoring rubric indicated it should be deprioritized, but she had noticed it. Tovesh said the signal was correctly classified as low priority. He said the exercise was designed to teach the identification of dominant variables. He said that students who attempt to track every signal simultaneously produce inferior outcomes to those who correctly triage. Orthan said yes, she understood that, but she was asking specifically about that signal, because in the current operational environment, a slow-building adaptive disruption in a secondary supply route carried a different predictive weight than the rubric assigned to it, because of the way interdiction patterns had shifted in the last 15 years. And Tovesh said the current operational environment was addressed in the fourth quarter curriculum. The debrief ended. I stayed in the observer gallery for several minutes after the cadets filed out. The hall below was empty, the projection arrays dark, the scoring interface still lit with the final state of the 22 decision threads. I looked at the threads for a while. Then I went back to my quarters and looked at my notes. They were extensive. The thing about observational authority is that it is not as limited as it sounds. I could not set coursework. I could not conduct formal assessments. I could not make notations in any cadet's record. I could, however, have lunch in the Institute's common hall, which was where the cadets ate, and where the conversation was general, and where a delegate could answer questions if questions were asked. I sat across from Orthan on the 5th day, and asked her what she had made of the exercise. She was cautious at first. I was a visiting delegate, technically affiliated with a foreign institution, and the Vareth are careful about hierarchy. She answered in the language of the exercise rubric, which was the safe language. I asked a follow-up question that was not in the language of the rubric, and she paused, and then she gave me a different answer. She said she thought the rubric was built for the wrong problem. I asked her what problem she thought she was being trained for. She described a conflict environment that was, in most of its structural features, the current environment. She had arrived at this independently, she said. The Institute's formal curriculum had not led her there. She had been reading outside the assigned materials, not widely. She did not have time for wide reading in a second quarter cohort, but pointedly. She had been reading the compact exchange records, which were available in the secondary library, and those records contained after-action documentation from the last 15 years that described a conflict landscape the Institute's exercises did not account for. I said that was good. I said that was, in my experience, the most useful habit a student could have. The assigned materials defined the floor. Reading beyond them was how you found the ceiling. She asked me what the compact academies were teaching about the current environment. I told her I was an observational delegate with no formal instructional authority. She said she understood. I told her I would be in the secondary library at 1700 hours that evening, which was when I usually reviewed my own notes, and the secondary library was a common space where any cadet could work. She nodded once, which was the Vareth way of indicating that a thing had been understood precisely. There were 4 of them the first evening. Orthan had brought 2 classmates, a large quiet male named Doresh, and a female cadet named Velthais who had an unsettling habit of finishing other people's sentences in a way that was generally correct. The 4th was a cadet I did not recognize, a younger student from the first-year cohort who had apparently heard something and attached himself to the group without being invited, which was a quality I found encouraging. I was reviewing my notes. They were working on their own materials. We were all in the secondary library. Orthan asked a question about the background noise signal. She framed it carefully as a theoretical question about triage methodology in distributed adaptive conflict environments, not about the exercise, about the general principle. I answered it as a general principle. Doresh asked a follow-up. His question was about the rate of change problem. Specifically, whether there was a methodology for assessing how quickly an adaptive disruption would escalate from marginal to critical. He had understood the core problem immediately and gone straight to the operational question. I answered it in some detail, because the operational question was the right one, and it had a reasonably good answer that my academy had developed over about 5 years of painful iteration. Velthais offered a third framing before I had finished answering Doresh, which cut 15 seconds off the cycle time of the conversation, and was either very clever or very annoying, and I had not yet decided which. Her framing was about the information requirements. She wanted to know what data you needed to assess rate of change, and where that data came from in a degraded intelligence environment. This was a harder question than either of the previous two, and I told her so, and I gave her the partial answer we had developed, which was partial because it was genuinely incomplete, and I wanted her to know that. The first-year cadet wrote everything down without asking questions, which told me he was in the phase of learning where he was still assembling the vocabulary to ask questions. That was a useful phase. You learn more in it than you think. You are building the scaffolding. We were in the library for 2 hours. I did not set coursework. I did not assess their performance. I reviewed my notes. They worked on their own materials, and we discussed general principles of triage methodology in distributed adaptive conflict environments. The next evening, there were 7 of them. I want to be precise about what I was and was not doing. I was not conducting a shadow curriculum. I was not attempting to undermine the Institute's formal instruction. I held the Vareth Defense Institute in genuine high regard. It had given me the foundation I had built 30 years of work on top of, and that foundation was still present in the structure of everything I taught. What the Institute had given me was real, and it had stayed real. What I was doing in the secondary library each evening was answering questions. The questions got more specific as the days went on. Orathan was sharp and systematic. She arrived each evening with a list, usually 5 or 6 items, always ordered from foundational to applied. She had the particular quality of a student who does not ask a question until she has exhausted what she can find out on her own, which meant her questions were precise and the answers mattered. Doresh was slower to formulate questions, but his questions were better. He sat with a problem longer, and the thing he finally asked was usually the thing that the others had been circling without quite landing on. There is a type of mind that does not speak until it has found the load-bearing question, and Doresh had that type of mind. Velthais thought in parallel threads and tended to ask 2 questions simultaneously, which was exhausting and also very efficient. She had 0 patience for linear exposition and would find the shortcut before I finished describing the long route, which meant I spent a fair amount of time explaining why the long route was worth understanding even when you knew the shortcut. She did not entirely agree with this. She was probably wrong, but she was not wrong by much, and she was sharp enough that being wrong by not much was still a more useful position than being right by a lot in a slower way. The first-year cadet, his name was Sarath, I eventually learned, had moved from writing without asking to asking without writing, which meant he had acquired enough vocabulary to have opinions. He was wrong about approximately 40% of the things he said with confidence, which was about average for a cadet at his stage, and significantly better than the 60% I had managed at the same point. When he was wrong in interesting ways, which is the most useful kind of wrong. He had not yet developed the habit of checking his confident statements against evidence before voicing them, but he would. That habit takes a few hundred iterations to build, and he was still in the early iterations. By the end of the second week, there were 11 cadets in the secondary library each evening. 3 of them were from Sarath's first-year cohort, which told me he had been talking. The sessions had acquired a rhythm. I arrived at 1700. Orathan was already there. She was always already there, with her list and her notes organized. The others came in over the next 20 minutes. We worked for 2 hours. Questions, answers, working through the implications, finding the places where my methodology had gaps, and the places where the Institute's methodology had complementary strengths that mine lacked. That was a real thing, the Vareth framework's strength in the static analysis, the fully developed case, the endpoint of a pressure cascade, was genuinely superior to anything my academy had produced. The framework they had built was more rigorous in its formal architecture. What we had built was more current. The best version of the thing would use both. There was something else happening in those evenings that I noted but did not comment on. The cadets were not just learning a methodology. They were learning that their existing methodology was not wrong, which mattered. There is a particular damage that occurs when you teach someone that what they already know is broken rather than incomplete. A student who is told their foundation is bad will either defend it past reason or abandon it wholesale, and both outcomes are failures. What I was trying to give them, by not calling the Institute's curriculum deficient, by insisting on the word extension rather than revision, by returning constantly to the fact that I had built everything I knew on what Tovesh had given me, was the experience of receiving an addition, not a correction. The foundation was solid. The foundation was worth defending. What they needed now was more floors, and more floors were only possible because the foundation could hold them. Whether I succeeded in conveying this was not something I could assess from inside the sessions. I could assess it from the questions. The questions did not have the quality of questions asked by people who believed they had been taught wrong. They had the quality of questions asked by people who were building upward. I said this to the group on the 11th evening. I said it directly. The Institute's methodology is not outdated in the places where it is strongest. It is outdated in the places where the threat environment changed after it was built. The correct thing to do is not to replace it. The correct thing is to extend it. Add the current threat model's variable priority framework on top of the existing foundation. Revise the triage criteria for the second and third quarter exercises. Keep the case studies, they are irreplaceable, and add 15 years' worth of new ones alongside them. Dorish asked, why hasn't the Institute done this already? I said I did not know. I had some guesses, but they were guesses about an institution's internal dynamics that I was not in a position to know from the outside, and guessing at other people's institutional dynamics was a good way to be wrong in ways that mattered. What I could say was that the work of revising a curriculum was genuinely difficult, that it required time and faculty resources, and a willingness to acknowledge that the existing curriculum was incomplete rather than wrong, and that the distinction between incomplete and wrong was not always easy to maintain under the pressure of a revision process. Orathan said, it is easier to keep teaching what is already known to be correct than to teach something that is still being worked out. I said yes, that was exactly it. She said, but the cadets who graduate from the current curriculum will go into operational environments for which they are not fully prepared. I said yes, they will compensate, smart people compensate, they will fill in the gaps from experience. But it would be better if they did not have to. What I was aware of, across those weeks in the library, was the quality of what I was receiving back. The Vareth cadets were not just absorbing material, they were testing it. Orathan had a habit of framing an answer I had given back to me as a hypothesis, and then offering a countercase to see if the answer held. Sometimes it held. Sometimes it held in 3 of its 4 applications and broke at the 4th edge, and then we had to work out together what to do about that. This was the most useful kind of disagreement, the kind that happens between people who are jointly trying to get the thing right rather than individually trying to win. Dorish found the structural question that had been underneath the entire body of material we had been discussing. He asked, on the 23rd evening, whether the adaptive disruption triage methodology I had described was itself adaptive, meaning whether it had a mechanism for updating its own variable priority rankings as the operational environment continued to shift. I said, that is the correct question, And the honest answer is that our version does not have a fully developed mechanism for that. We have an iteration process. We review and revise every 2 years, but the revision is episodic, not built into the methodology itself. He nodded slowly, in the way he nodded when he was thinking about something he was not going to speak on for a few minutes. I watched him think. 2 minutes later, he proposed a structure. It was not fully formed, and some of its assumptions needed work, but the architecture was sound. I told him so. He looked at me for a moment with the same expression Orothan had worn in the lecture hall, the expression of someone checking whether the answer they received was the shape of the answer they needed. Then he picked up his notebook and started writing. Velthais, who had been listening to all of this without speaking for the previous hour, said, "You should document that before you leave." I said I intend to. Tovesh came to find me on the 28th day. He found me in the eastern courtyard, where I had taken to walking in the early evening before the library sessions. He was direct about it. He said he had noticed a pattern in certain cadets' recent exercise performance. He said the pattern suggested external input that was not reflected in the formal curriculum. He said he was asking me directly whether I had been providing informal instruction to members of the current cohort. I said I was an observational delegate with no formal instructional authority. He said he was aware of the terms of my appointment. I said I had been working in the secondary library each evening, as was consistent with my delegate status, and that various cadets had been working in the same space, as was consistent with their status as members of a learning institution, and that we had discussed general principles on occasion. He was quiet for a moment. The courtyard had the last of the lights still in it, the amber tone that this sector gets in the early evening, and it fell across the pale stone at a low angle and made the mineral veining glow faintly. It had looked the same when I was 18. Some things are very stable. He said the Institute's curriculum had served its students for 300 years. I said that was true. He said the framework the Institute taught was correct. I said it was. The framework was correct. The framework he had taught me was one of the most rigorous analytical systems I had encountered in 30 years of working in this field. I had never stopped using it. I had never taught a class without it. I had built everything I knew on top of it. He looked at me steadily. He said that the implication in that statement was that I had built on top of the framework he had taught me. I said yes. He said the Institute continued to teach the framework. I said yes. He said, and you believe the Institute should be building on top of it as well. I did not say yes or no immediately. I let the question sit for a moment because it deserved a careful answer, and because I did not want to give him the answer that sounded like a verdict when what I meant was an observation. I said that the framework he had given me was built to address the conflict environment of 300 years of Vareth strategic experience. I said that 34 years ago, when I was a cadet here, that environment had been close to accurate. I said that the environment had since changed in ways that did not invalidate the framework. Nothing invalidated the framework. The framework was structurally sound, but that required additions to it. New case studies, new variable sets, new triage criteria for a threat profile that looked different from the Vanthai coastal engagements and the Oresh border consolidation and the 3-year supply failure at Kesset Station. He said, and you have been making those additions. I said my academy had been making them. My colleagues, my former students who had gone to their own academies and made more. The accumulated work of 30 years of humans building on the foundation the Vareth had given them. The Vareth Defense Institute was in every syllable of every class I had ever taught. My cadets knew that. I made sure they knew it. The foundation was not mine. I had just kept building. He was quiet for a long moment, longer than the earlier silences. The light was going. The courtyard would be dark in 20 minutes. He said, and your cadets attend your library sessions each evening. I said general principles were discussed. He said nothing more that evening. He turned and walked back into the building with the particular deliberateness of a man who had more to think about than he had expected, and I stayed in the courtyard for a few more minutes, watching the last of the amber light dissolve, and then I went to the secondary library. There were 14 cadets waiting. The academic board review was called on the 42nd day. I received a formal notification through the exchange coordinator. Tessavith brought it to my quarters with an expression that suggested she was uncertain what to make of it. The review was not of my conduct. It was of the cohort's recent exercise performance. The board wanted to understand what was producing a significant positive shift in performance metrics, specifically a 31 percentage point improvement in distributed adaptive scenario outcomes across the 11 cadets who had shown the most consistent change. I was asked if I would be willing to appear before the board to speak to what I had observed during my time at the Institute. I was an observational delegate. Observation was precisely what I was there to provide. I said yes. The board chamber was a room I had not been in before. It was in the older part of the building, behind the main faculty wing, high-ceilinged and stone-walled, with a curved table at which 8 faculty members sat and a single chair at the front of the room. Tovesh was at the table. He had the expression of a man who has arrived at a position before the argument and is waiting to see if the argument will reach him. I sat in the single chair. The board chair, an older female faculty member named Varath, who had been at the Institute for longer than anyone else on the board, asked me to describe what I had observed about the current cohort's performance in the exercises I had attended. I described it accurately. I described the distributed adaptive scenario exercise on the 4th day. I described what I had observed in the cadets' decision-making, the correct application of the triage methodology to the variables the rubric was designed to address, and the systematic deprioritization of the adaptive disruption signal that the rubric correctly identified as low priority under the existing threat model. I described the gap between the rubric's treatment of that signal and what the current evidence base, accumulated over 15 years of documented conflict environment analysis, suggested about its actual strategic priority. I described it without qualification, without softening, and without attributing blame to anyone. The rubric was doing what it had been designed to do. The design was based on a threat model. The threat model had not been updated. I did not describe the library sessions in any detail. The board had access to whatever attendance records existed. I had attended the library. Cadets had attended the library. General principles had been discussed. Varath asked me a direct question. She said, "In your assessment, is the Institute's formal curriculum providing cadets with adequate preparation for the current operational environment?" I said the Institute's formal curriculum was providing cadets with an excellent foundation in the structural architecture of conflict analysis. I said the framework was sound, the pedagogy was rigorous, and the case study methodology was among the best I had encountered anywhere. I said that my cadets at home had been taught from this curriculum and had gone on to produce work I was proud of. She said, "And the current environment?" I said the current environment required additions to the foundation, not revisions. The foundation did not need to be revised. It needed to be extended. New case studies from the last 15 years. New triage criteria derived from distributed adaptive conflict analysis. A restructuring of the variable priority hierarchies in the 2nd and 3rd quarter exercises to reflect the changed threat profile. I said, "The Varath Defense Institute taught me how to think about this problem. The work I am describing is 30 years of continuing to think about it. That work belongs to the Institute as much as it belongs to me. It was made from what you gave me. You gave the framework to 12 humans 34 years ago, and those 12 humans went home and taught it to others, and those others built on it and taught it again, and it has been growing in our academies ever since. Every piece of it traces back to this building. It is yours. I am just returning what was always yours in a form that is now large enough to be useful again." Varath looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who has been told a thing they already knew, but needed to hear said plainly. Then she looked at Tovesh. Tovesh was looking at the table in front of him, not down. He was not looking down in the way of someone who has lost an argument. He was looking at the table in the way of someone whose mind is occupied with a structural problem. I recognized that look. He had worn it in lectures when a student's question had located a gap he needed to think about. It was the look of a man doing the work. I had spent a fair amount of time in the preceding weeks wondering how this moment would go if it came. Tovesh had built this curriculum. He had been teaching from it for 30 years, the same 30 years I had been extending it elsewhere. The natural shape of that situation is a conflict, and I had wanted to avoid conflict both because conflict would have been unproductive and because it would have been wrong. He had not done anything wrong. He had kept teaching the thing he knew, which was an excellent thing, and the fact that the world had moved around it was not a fault in his teaching. I did not want him to experience this as a defeat, because it was not a defeat. It was a gap, and gaps were what teaching was for. He looked up from the table. After a moment he said, "The curriculum would require a complete review of the variable priority framework." I said yes. He said, "A complete review would take a full academic cycle, possibly two." I said that in my experience it took as long as it took, and that starting it was the first step. He said, "We would need substantial documentation of the additions that have been made to the framework in other institutions over the last 30 years. I said I had 30 years worth of documentation. The board chamber was quiet. Outside I could hear the faint sound of cadets on the exercise grounds, some kind of early morning physical assessment, judging by the rhythm of it. Steady, even not hurried, doing the work. Varath asked me if I was in a position to provide that documentation in a form the board could use to begin a curriculum review. I said I had come here as an observational delegate with no formal instructional authority, and my mandate from the Compact Exchange Office was to observe and to produce a report. She said, "Then produce a report that includes your documentation." I said I could do that. The remaining 18 days of my appointment were different from the first 42. The library sessions continued. The cadets who had been attending brought the question forward to the others, and by the final week all 22 members of the second quarter cohort were attending, which made the secondary library rather full, and we moved to one of the smaller lecture rooms, which was technically a use of institute facilities that my delegate status permitted because it was also a common space. I asked Tessavith about this. She said the smaller lecture rooms were available to delegate personnel for personal study. I said I would be using one for personal study. She said she understood, and her tone indicated that she understood more than the literal statement conveyed, and that she was content with this. I had been traveling with a copy of my academy's complete curriculum documentation, 2 academic cycles worth, the last full revision cycle we had completed before I left. I had brought it because I always travel with my working files. It had not occurred to me when I packed it that I would need it for anything other than background reference. It now became the backbone of the documentation I was preparing for the board. I also had 30 years of teaching notes, organized by subject, in a format that I had developed over time and which was, I would say with appropriate humility, reasonably well organized. I spent the evenings I was not in the lecture room sorting through those notes and translating them into a structure the Institute's faculty could use. It was more work than I had expected. It was also, unexpectedly, clarifying. There is something about having to present your own thinking to someone else that makes you see where the gaps are. I found 3 places in the notes where I had been teaching from an implicit assumption that I had never made explicit, which meant my cadets had been learning the method without necessarily learning why the method worked. I added explanatory sections to those 3 places. The documentation that went to the board was better than the documentation I had arrived with. Orathan helped. She was meticulous and structured, and she read everything I produced with the kind of attention that produces useful corrections. She found 3 places where I had been imprecise about variable definitions, which was the legacy of having used those definitions for so long that I had stopped examining them. I thanked her for those corrections. She said she was glad the documentation would be accurate. She said it without irony. She meant it exactly as stated, which was the way Orathan tended to mean things. Doresh, when he read the revised triage framework I had written for the board, sat with it for a long time and then asked one question. He said, "Is it possible that the framework could be extended further, and that what I was giving them was itself already outdated?" I said yes, that was how frameworks worked. You built the next floor on top of the last one. The Institute had built the ground floor, and it was solid, and humanity had been building on it for 30 years, and what I was giving them was up to this floor. There would be a next floor. The cadets in this room would build it. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "Then we will need to keep building." I said that was correct. Sarath, who was still in the room, still nominally attending informally, still technically from the first-year cohort, said, "And next time when we give it to someone, they will keep building too." I said, "That is precisely how it works." I filed my report on the 59th day. It ran to 412 pages, of which approximately 30 were the observational assessment the Compact Exchange Office had actually asked for. The remainder was the curriculum documentation. I submitted it through the formal channels to the Compact Exchange Office, and through a separate channel that Tessavith arranged with the board's approval, directly to the academic board for their review. Varath sent a formal acknowledgement the following morning. She said the board had received the documentation and would begin the review process in the next academic cycle. She said the board was grateful for the delegates' contribution to the Institute's ongoing curriculum work. She said the formal acknowledgement of the contribution would be reflected in the Institute's academic record. I read the acknowledgement and put it in my file. On the morning of the 60th day, I packed my bag, which did not take long because I travel light. I went to the eastern courtyard for my walk. It was early, the light still low and thin, the stone cold under the day's first warmth. Orathan found me there. She had her bag with her. She was heading to a morning assessment not to see me off. But she had come to the courtyard early enough to find me there, which was deliberate. She said, "I wanted to say the Varath know how to build things, structures that last. We were taught that here. We build frameworks and we trust them." I said, "Yes." She said, "I think what we were not taught was to keep building after the structure is finished." I thought about that for a moment. I looked at the pale stone of the courtyard, the amber veining that ran through it, the way the morning light caught the mineral content and made the walls look briefly warm before the day settled into its cooler register. I said, "The Varath built the ground floor. Everything above it belongs to everyone who added to it. But it would not exist without the foundation, and the foundation was yours." She said, "Then we were not giving, we were lending." I thought about that framing. I considered whether it was accurate. I decided it was at least as accurate as any framing I could offer, and more interesting than most. I said, "Then consider it returned with interest." She nodded once, the precise Varath nod, and went to her assessment. I stood in the courtyard for a few more minutes. The light had gone from the warm register back to the cool one that was the default for this part of the sector at this time of day. The heating system in the building was running quietly, efficiently, the new system they had installed since my year here. It did a better job than the old one. It was cleaner and quieter, and you barely noticed it working. Some things, when they were improved, should not be conspicuous about it. The work was still happening. You just could not hear the effort anymore. I picked up my bag and went to catch the transit. My second years were running a revised perimeter assessment when I returned. I watched from the window. Cadet Dresch had corrected his left flank problem, which either meant my coverage instructor had addressed it or he had figured it out himself, and I made a note to find out which before I praised him for it. The curriculum documentation from the Institute's board review cycle came to me 3 months later, forwarded through the Compact Exchange office. It was a formal request for review and comment. They had taken the material I provided, worked through it with the full faculty, and were preparing to begin revising the variable priority framework and the distributed adaptive scenario exercise sets. They had questions about 3 sections. The questions were good. Tovesh had written 2 of them. I sat down at my desk and began writing the responses. The work was not finished. The work was not the kind of thing that finished. You built what you could build, you gave it away, and the people you gave it to built more. That was the mechanism. That was the whole mechanism. It had taken me 30 years to understand it as clearly as I understood it now, sitting at my desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold while I was thinking, writing answers to questions from the institution that had taught me everything I started with. I answered the questions, I sent them back. Then I picked up the stack of second-year fieldwork submissions that had been waiting since Tuesday, and I got to work.